Hi, I'm Malika Bilal.
I'm Ahmed Shabuddin, and you're in the stream.
Today, disability and the U.S. election, part 2.
People with disabilities are the world's largest minority according to the United Nations, yet their culture and concerns are often overlooked.
In the U.S., Americans with disabilities are changing that this election season. And those in our community are so fired up about their voting rights, we've dedicated 2 full shows to those concerns. Joining us to discuss, Lawrence Carter Long is a spokesman for the National Council of Disability. In Winsboro, South Carolina, Vilissa Thompson is a writer and disability rights consultant with the group Ramp Your Voice. In Plattsburgh, New York, Andrew Polrang is a disability rights advocate and co-creator of the Crip the Vote campaign. And in Los Angeles, California, Thomas Coleman is legal director with the Spectrum Institute. So I want to take our guests and our audience back to a key moment in the fight for disability rights. Here's former President George H.W. Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act to ban discrimination and ensure equal opportunity in employment. Here's that historic moment.
Today's signing of the landmark Americans for Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom.
But those doors still aren't open for everyone. When it comes to voting rights, those with intellectual or cognitive disabilities often find the door closed. Lawrence, I know that you were key and instrumental in making sure that that act was what we see today, and yet now we're 2016. Do you think that what President Bush there was articulating, do you think that's true today?
Well, what we have now is teeth. We've got some muscle. We've got something to back it up, right? So the moral impetus was always there. I think the concern was always there. What we now have is a way to enforce it. What we now have is a way to push it. Sadly, though, as you intoned, currently, let's say in the 2012 election, 1 in 5 voters with disabilities were not able to cast their vote privately and independently in a way that non-disabled voters can take for granted. We found that 50% of those who went had trouble with access, not only access like within the machine itself or the technology, but also with attitude from the poll workers and the people
So poll workers saying, I don't want to help you, or I can't help you?
Not knowing how to work the machines, not knowing how to do that. If I didn't know how to do my job, I'd be out of a job very quickly. But they didn't get adequately trained. And 40% of them couldn't even get in the building to vote. So those shameful walls are still there for millions and millions of voters with disabilities. 1 in 6 of people that are eligible to vote, that's 35 million Americans, are disabled Americans. And we're just now starting to recognize that as a constituency to be reckoned with.
My introduction to the voting rights issue for people with disabilities happened just about 3 years ago when I started having people referred to me who were being excluded from voting because they were entering into a conservatorship or a guardianship. And for those who don't know what that is, it's a proceeding in state courts when someone is appointed to make decisions for somebody else on the theory that the person with the disability is unable to make his or her own decisions. And what I found through case after case was that the judges and the attorneys that were processing these cases in the guardianship systems were stripping people of their voting rights in just a routine manner, just assuming that they lacked the capacity to vote. So I did an audit of dozens and dozens of cases and found that in Los Angeles County alone, 90% of the people who were going through these conservatorships were being stripped of their right to vote. So I studied the law really quickly, and we filed a voting rights complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice, and they studied it for almost a year, and then they accepted the complaint and opened a statewide investigation against the state of California. And as a result of that investigation and that complaint, legislation got passed in California to change the rules so that now if somebody can just express a desire to vote, that's it, just say or type or whatever their method of communication is, indicate a desire to vote, they cannot lose their right to vote in a conservatorship proceeding. The problem was, and remains today, the 32,000 people who were stripped of their right to vote, and it hasn't been reinstated.
So I just want to pause you for a second there, Thomas,
Yeah.
because it can be abstract. Can you give us an example of one of the cases that you worked on? Kind of walk us through what happened.
Yeah, well, I'm going to walk you through the most recent one that occurred. I went down to San Diego about a month and a half ago after I got a call from a woman saying that her fiance was stripped of his right to vote in a conservatorship case in 2011, and he wanted his right to vote reinstored so that he could vote in this upcoming election in November. And she reached out to disability groups and to lawyers, and nobody would help them. He actually didn't have a cognitive disability. People assumed he did. He was his name is David Rector. He was a producer with the National Public Radio for many, many years. He experienced an illness, kind of a rare illness that left him quadriplegic, and he couldn't speak or write. He could process information, he could think, he could understand, but the judge made the assumption that he lacked capacity, stripped him of his right to vote. So when I heard about that case, I thought, I've been concerned about the 32,000 others like him who had lost their right to vote.
Right.
And I thought his case can be an example. So we went down, we filed a new complaint with the Department of Justice, we held a protest march, marched to the local courthouse, got publicity around it, and reluctantly, the judge kind of held her nose, which was ridiculous, and reluctantly reinstored his right to vote, but he got his right to vote back.
Well, congratulations.
It should not take that type of an effort to regain your right to vote, and you shouldn't lose it to begin with.
Tom is absolutely right. Disabled voters are being held to this impossible standard. Just because someone may not have the capacity, let's say, to manage their money, or you might not like their relationships that they have, right? Would we hold non-disabled people to that standard? How many non-disabled people do you know that are in debt, right? That don't know how to handle their money. But you can't assume because of that somebody isn't able to vote or has the ability to understand who they want the president to be or their local officials to be. And so it's unfair.
These assumptions that people are making, that the legal system makes, leads me to a non-voting issue, one of the issues that should be under discussion, and there's so much at stake in this election. And I heard somebody earlier talking about now we have resources and now we have means to enforce federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the moral imperative was there before, but now we have the means. That is true. It's federal intervention that has made all the difference in the world. And what's at stake now is, with the next administration, are we going to have adequate funding for the Department of Justice, or are they going to reduce the funding?
The questions everyone's asking.
Who's elected to be president is going to have a huge outcome on the resources that are put into enforcing federal law rather than letting every state and local community just do whatever it wants to.
Most certainly, and obviously those are questions that people are asking. People are also talking about what is the best way to advocate for their rights. And I want to kind of draw your attention to a conversation, Andrew, that I think you were having online with someone. You said, I come from the school of thought that it's important to emphasize the unity of disability experiences, not fragment them. You had a response from David Poland saying some groups will get needs met and others not when it's grouped. Think white privilege. And I think he also went on to say, I even question categorizing diversity by one label. Should we? CP and deaf are so different. What do you think? I mean, is that a real obstacle beyond all the ones that we've discussed, this idea of not being unified?
Well, I'm looking at a history of disability where the traditional way for disabled people to advocate was to kind of stick in their own, subgroup. People with CP had a CP organization. People with muscular dystrophy had that organization. They all had their own little things, and they may all have been working on important stuff. And it's not that it was unimportant. But one of the things the Americans with Disabilities Act did, almost for the first time, was to really formally say there is also a larger category, that is people with disabilities. And they're very diverse and very different, but they do share experiences in common is particularly social discrimination type of experiences.
And go ahead.
If you've got a situation where 70–75% of people with disabilities, no matter what your condition is, are underemployed or unemployed, that's a shared experience, right? So you don't have to, narrow yourself down to saying I have this condition or that condition. The law is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not called the Americans with Special Needs Act.
Right.
It's not called the Different Abilities Act. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. Disability is protected in the law, which the executive director of NCD, Rebecca Coakley, says all the time. The basic gist is this: there's nothing special about a need that other people can take for granted. Voting is one of those needs, one of those rights that disabled people have been denied.
I'd like to raise another issue, and this is outside of the voting arena itself, but a substantive issue, and that is access to justice. It's about time that the Americans with Disabilities Act is applied to state and local courts and these judicial proceedings for people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities. It's great that at least the judges and lawyers have learned about physical access and sign language interpreters and other issues of physical access and so on. But people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities have been left behind. They're drawn in these guardianship proceedings. They're drawn into them involuntarily, and then their rights are threatened to be taken away. And in 20 states, they don't even get a lawyer appointed. And in the states where they get a lawyer, the lawyers don't advocate for them. And I think it's time that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to judicial proceedings and that the judges get the message that they have to provide accommodations to people with intellectual disabilities so that they can have meaningful access to justice, just like other people do as well.
I want to shift gears just a little bit here because in overarching this conversation, but Alyssa, I want to bring you in, but in overarching this conversation is something that one of our guests said: diverse group with a shared experience. So within that diverse group, we are hearing from lots of different subgroups, I guess you could say, lots of different people who say that they share that experience, but also know that there are differences. And I want to bring our attention to a hashtag, Alyssa, that you started, you're credited with starting, Disability to White. So this is one of the articles on it, and this is how people are using that hashtag. This is Mei Li. She says, linking us back to the elections and election campaign. Hillary Clinton, I'm really liking your ads, but I'm noticing a little disability to white trend kicking up. What does she mean by that? Explain for us and why it matters.
Well, I said similar sentiments about Hillary Clinton and really other politicians as well when it comes to who they have as the face of disability when they discuss disability, which is typically white disabled people or white passing disabled people. For me, what missing from the conversation that we just had is the intersectionality piece. Yes, we may all be disabled, but we do not have a shared experience. My experience as a Black disabled woman is not the same as Andrew's, as Lawrence. And there are barriers that being a racial minority may present to voting in addition to being disabled. As someone who is, for myself, has a physical disability, someone may perceive me as having an intellectual disability because of those stereotypes. And also thinking that Black disabled people all have intellectual disabilities, or Black disabled people may not be as intelligent as others. So we have to think about the intersectionality piece of racism and ableism when it comes to the disenfranchisement of disabled voters. And when it comes to politicians, thinking about the intersectionality piece, when we talk about education, Black disabled students are experiencing the school-to-prison pipeline at higher rates than their white disabled counterparts. So when we talk about issues that relate to disabled people, we cannot just talk about disability. We must talk about those marginalized categories that many of us are members of, and how that experience, in addition to disability, is affecting our quality of life and, in this situation, our ability to vote.
Alyssa is absolutely right, because if you're multiply marginalized, then you're multiply at risk. And if you don't address all the factors that contribute to that, it might be disability, it might be race, it might be gender, it might be age. You multiply all those things, add them up together, your rights are going to be more at risk than somebody who doesn't is seen with any of those things. And so we've got to understand that some people, the things that some people have to contend with are not the same things that other people have to contend with, and it takes a different shape, which is why it's important for us to come together together in unity and say, we need this, because once you provide access, once access is there, everybody benefits. There's no downside. You know, it's like with curb cuts. They didn't want to put the curb cuts in. They said, oh, nobody's using them. Who's going to use them? We never see wheelchairs.
Really? That was the conversation.
They put the wheelchairs in, and all of a sudden wheelchairs were everywhere.
I can't even imagine.
And then not only that,
curb
but
without them.
That's right. And then you got people with their luggage carts. You've got people with baby strollers.
Yeah.
You've got pretzel vendors. Everybody's happy. Rollerbladers. Everybody's happy because of the curb cuts. And that's because that access issue made it better for everyone. It's the same with voting. It's the same for everything.
You know, everyone benefits, and yet, as you're pointing out, Vailisa, rightfully so, that, you know, everyone has a different experience. We asked one of the questions in a Twitter chat earlier on Twitter, and this was it. What do you wish the media knew when covering disability issues or policies? Deborah responded saying that prisons are filled with people with disability, and most victims of police violence are disabled, usually people of color. I see her nodding because she's essentially echoing your point there. But one other answer from Deborah I thought was notable. I want to put this to you, Thomas. She said that it's legal for some employers to pay sub-minimum wages of pennies an hour to people with disabilities. Yeah. Thomas?
Yeah, I think there have been some exceptions that have been carved into the law for certain types of work for people with intellectual disabilities, for example. And so there's some people arguing in favor of the exception, and some are arguing against it. So, but I think that is an issue that should be in the political arena and should be addressed.
What Tom's talking about is a waiver, in a 14C waiver, in something called the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's from 1935.
Wow.
It's 80 years old. None of us are driving around in Model Ts anymore, so we shouldn't be following the standard of that
So it's never
law.
been re-looked at? It's never been brought to the table?
They've made amendments, they've made changes throughout the years, but the provision which allows them to continue to pay disabled people pennies on the dollar exists. The idea is, the assumption, which the mindset is still there, is that disabled people aren't going to be as productive, so we therefore pay them less. The National Council on Disability did a survey, 7 different states, of these sheltered workshops just a few years back. I'll never forget going and meeting a young woman who was getting her first paycheck, and she was eager to go and take her parents out to dinner. Her paycheck was for $2.
Wow.
You know?
Wow.
And so she couldn't do that. The other thing about these places is that the most sheltered workshop, the idea is to get them out of the sheltered workshop into the community working competitively. 95% of the people in sheltered workshops, disabled people, never leave. It's the Hotel California of employment schemes, and it's high time that it was updated.
Andrew, I see you trying to jump in there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that it is not an overlooked provision. I mean, it's not something that people forgot about. Most people didn't know about it, but you know,
And they're counting on people not knowing about it.
This is on This is on purpose, and you might argue over whether the purposes are good or bad. And I think they're a mix, but it's very out of date. The good news is, to an extent, is that that's one of the issues that got disability into the forefront of this particular election campaign, is that early on some advocates went to town meetings and were asking about, what about this? What would you do about this? And Hillary Clinton and also Bernie Sanders both have endorsed getting rid of the sub-minimum wage. So it's a very specific issue that actually got addressed, at least at the campaign level. And we obviously have yet to see what will happen after, but there it is.
And we can only hope that all these issues that we're bringing up will get addressed. But with that in mind, just very quickly, you know, our community is responding in real time to this show. And Tom, David and Roz on Twitter want you to know, or the world to know really, that you are a national treasure for disabled voters who are conserved. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, I would presume, for helping them regain their right to vote.
Wow. Well, they're leaders in the movement to get rights restored to people, and it was a wonderful experience working with them, very inspiring and energizing.
So in making sure that people know their rights, there are groups out there who are trying to do just that, do what you do there, Tom, and educating people to make sure that they're able to seize those rights. I want you all to take a look at a little clip that's floating around on the internet on lessons on voting rights. Now, they come in many languages, including sign language. So here's a civic education video by Rooted in Rights.
Are you planning to vote? Yes, I am. Yes, I do vote.
Yes, I definitely plan to go vote. I must vote.
Why should deaf people vote?
Deaf people really struggle to find work and to get equal access in the community.
We want to make sure that our rights in the community are protected.
Deaf people should be voting to let the government know what we want and what we need to have.
It's your opportunity to tell the government what to do for you.
So they listed a few of the rights and the issues that they care about most. For you, what's at the top of your list for things that you think need to be addressed going forward?
For me, education, the school to prison pipeline, like I mentioned earlier, is something that definitely affects disabled students of color. And also access. I know that I read lawsuits all the time of school districts failing to provide just the basic accommodations for disabled students when they have a right to, because of the ADA, IDEA, and other mandates that say that we have a right to be in our schools and we have a right to a free and appropriate education. So for me, education, of course, healthcare, protecting the Affordable Care Act against being scrapped away. Also, for me, police brutality as a Black disabled person, I know that Black disabled lives matter and Black lives matter, and really doing more to address Black disabled people and other people of color dying in our streets by the hand of police, really bringing that more to the forefront. And also talk about mass incarceration that was mentioned earlier. Disabled people being in prison, not getting their accommodations that they need, that is protected under the ADA. So really strengthening the laws and talking about how can we do that to protect the rights of disabled people after the election is over.
Yeah, you know, so many people wanting to share their own thoughts as to what they care about, and one of them, in terms of what they think we should talk about, is Michelle kind of maybe somewhat sarcastically saying, it's really sad that I even have to remind people that disabled people are full-fledged human beings. It might not seem like a specific policy issue she wants addressed, but if that's the starting point of the conversation for her, I can imagine how exasperating that could be.
Yeah, you look at it historically, you know, disability in people's minds has always happened in isolation. It's a diagnosis, it's a medical condition that happened to this person or that person. What we're seeing now is disability used to be a diagnosis, now it's an identity, now it's a community, now it's a constituency that you can't take for granted. You screw something up and disabled people are going to take to Twitter and they're going to call you out on it. Right. It's the first time that's ever really happened in the way before. The first time we've had Twitter chats like you're addressing right now. You know, you talk about issues like police violence. Most people don't know that the victims of police violence, up to 50% of those individuals are disabled individuals. Even when it's reported in the media, disability is often left out of the equation. You're not going to address the full issue. If you are telling a deaf person, basically, to put up their hands, they don't hear you, that deaf person gets shot, right? It's you're asking that person, you're demanding that person not be disabled. That's impossible. It's also a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we've got to understand that the way that we address these issues, we have to do it holistically and comprehensively, or we're not going to get the job done.
For me, the top issue is freedom from abuse. We have to start with freedom from being abused by anybody, not just police. By the time a person reaches the age of 18, the vast majority of people with disabilities have been victims of abuse, and the abuse is generally perpetrated by people in their immediate circle of support, parents, relatives, neighbors, service providers, etc. That issue is being swept under the rug all too often. It's an inconvenient truth, but I think we need to address it, and we need to strengthen ways to reduce the risk of abuse and to respond appropriately so victims get therapy and they get justice.
Perfect way to end this conversation. Unfortunately, we are all out of time. I want to thank our guests for this important conversation. It's just the beginning of our special U.S. election coverage on TV and online. I want to give the last word to a member of our community, Louis Ahmed.
This is Louis Bossing with his thoughts on what needs to change.
This is Louis Bossing from the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. People with mental disabilities have had their rights to vote taken away. People with mental disabilities have opinions about issues and candidates and have the right to vote. They also have the right to get help with voting from the person of their choice. So don't deny the right of a person with a mental disability the right to vote.
Our thanks to Lewis for that comment. Stick with us, hashtag AJStream and hashtag StreamElects.